Well, hello and welcome to my darkroom here at home. And today I want to make a color RA4 print with you guys. You might ask yourself, why print color in a darkroom, and maybe why shoot film at all. And basically, for me, shooting film is a way to make prints in a darkroom. So I'm much more of a printer than a photographer, I think. At least it's what a friend of mine tells me, and I think I agree with him. So we're going to do some color prints. This is a very small one that I had on my living room wall for a while. We're going to make one that's slightly bigger. And the reason why I'm showing you this is that basically I want to demonstrate it's not necessarily very difficult to make a color print at home with fairly simple materials. And that means we're going to do it at, as it's called, room temperature. So I'm not going to use a fancy roller transport processor. I'm not even going to use the Yobo that I have here in the corner for prints. So I'm going to do it all in trays, which means that we have to work in the dark, at least during development of the print. So I cannot show you that step, but I can show you, guide you through the entire process of essentially, selecting the paper and the negative all the way to the finished print. And it may take some time to explain it all, but actually if you do it in practice, it's a pretty fast process. So I hope you enjoy the show, and let's go on for a ride. So of course to print we need paper, and this is some prints I made last week from medium format negatives. And these are made on Fuji paper, and maybe you can tell from the light it hits it, it's a lustrous surface. Up until now I've printed mostly on luster, also some gloss. I think I'm going to switch to gloss altogether. It doesn't really matter much for making the prints, it's just a choice of material. And on the choice of material, essentially you've got two big brands that do color paper. It's Fuji and Kodak. And here in Europe, where I am, Fuji is the easiest to get, and Kodak supply is a bit limited at this point. This is 2020. We've got all sorts of issues with the Kodak plant and of course the COVID situation. Fuji is generally pretty easy to get, so if you're selecting a paper, then odds are that you're going to end up with Fuji, although I do like the Kodak papers as well. This particular paper is a Fuji Crystal Archive Supreme HD digital premium paper. It's quite a mouthful, and you can identify most papers by the writing on the back side. I'm not sure if you can see it on camera right now. Maybe I can get a close-up shot of it. So this is a paper, and as it says, it's for digital premium. And this may be a bit confusing, because you may wonder, like, is this appropriate for darkroom printing using an enlarger? And yes, it works perfectly, in fact, but it's also optimized for digital process printing in high volume labs. And actually those high volume labs are the reason why we have this paper at a very affordable price anyway, because these high volume labs where you send your prints off, your digital files off, and they send you the prints back, that is where the volume is being made. So they use miles and miles of this kind of paper, and that helps to keep the costs down. So effectively this paper is even cheaper than the cheapest black and white paper, but you get color to boot. So this is the Fuji paper that I'm going to use today as well. And if you buy it, there's two options again. It's either cut sheets, so that's already cut to size, or it's on rolls. And I personally use rolls because cut sheet availability is very limited, so only Fuji cuts paper to sheets that you can buy in boxes, very convenient boxes. There's some third parties that cut down paper from various sources, but you never quite know the quality that you're going to get, if it's fresh paper, if it's properly handled. So I would say, only the Fuji paper in cut sheet is very reliable. And if you don't want to be limited to the choice of Fuji paper that comes in cut sheet, you're going to be stuck with rolls. And so I choose rolls because it gives me a bit more options for using different kinds of papers. And this particular paper, I don't think is available in cut sheet at all. So I'm really limited to rolls if I want to use this kind of premium paper. And the paper that Fuji sells in cut sheet is the Fuji Crystal Archive Type 2. I know for sure that's available in cut sheet. But it's a very thin paper, it's much thinner than this, it's very flimsy. And the problem with that paper that I find is that if you print a lot of low-key images with big stretches of black, the black never comes out quite nicely. So it's always a mottled dark brown, and if you hold it in good light, it's never, you know, quite perfectly black. And getting good blacks is it's the Achilles heel basically of RA4 color paper, at least in my experience. It gets a pretty good black. It's never going to be as nicely black as a good black and white print. But still, it gets the job done, at least if you used a decent paper. And I would say the cheapest Fuji paper, so the Crystal Archive Type 2 paper, the very thin paper, it's not a very good paper. I find it pretty disappointing. I thought I was doing something wrong with it, but it turned out that prints I got from commercial labs that I was shown, they showed exactly the same problems. Even they can be expected to have their process parameters all perfectly right and stuff like that. So this is the Fuji Crystal Archive paper that I use, and like I said, I get it from rolls, so you can buy these rolls, and this is a 30 centimeter paper, so it's 12 inches on this dimension, and so it comes on a cardboard core. So if you buy a roll of paper, this core is going to be inside, and the paper is basically rolled up on it with the surface, the printing surface, towards the outside. So it's always emulsion out by default on these rolls of paper. And these rolls, the 30 centimeter rolls, I think they're about 90 meters. So it's a pretty big stash of paper that you get from a single roll. It's pretty heavy as well. It's a pretty big roll. This is just the core, so the entire roll is something like this. And of course, if you get that roll at home, you have the challenge of having to cut that down to size, because generally you kind of print directly from the roll, so you want to cut it into sheets. And of course you need to do that in the perfect dark, because it's color paper, it's sensitive to any kind of light, it's also sensitive to very, very low light levels, so in practice that means you have to work in pitch black darkness. And that may sound sort of difficult to do, but in practice it's not very difficult at all once you get used to it. There's a little, tips and tricks that I got. Maybe I can show you something about that later on. But in the end, you'll have to just get used to working in the dark, which is not very challenging. So, challenge to get the paper from this core on the roll into a conveniently cut sheet size. And for that I use a very, very low-tech setup that I can just set up in a few minutes, and it consists of basically a cutter and a holder for my roll. So let me put this aside for a little bit. So this is my cutter that I use for that. It's a box standard Dali rotary cutter. I got it actually for free from a good friend of mine. He wasn't using it, he prefers a guillotine cutter, but I don't like guillotine cutters in the dark. So this was basically a leftover, and I've been using it to my satisfaction for a year or so. And as you may notice, I've got these magnetic strips on it. It has this metal base plate, and I can very conveniently put these magnetic strips on it. You can get these from many stores. I got this online, and I just put this here at the 30.5 centimeter mark. So the paper width, let me get a sheet. The paper width is exactly what fits between the stop on this end and then the magnetic stop that I put here. So this is my rotary cutter set up, and then of course if I want to feed a roll of paper through it, I need a contraption to make that work. So what I do is I position the cutter like this, and then I have this little thing here. It's very low tech, it's very simple, it's very ugly as well, but it gets the job done. And it's basically just a hole, it's just a tube suspended between two bars, and I can put the roll onto that. So let me demonstrate. There's a little locking pin that I can pull out. And if I have my roll of paper, of course it's going to be much heavier and full, and I have to do this in the dark, but I can lift this and just put the roll on, put the pin back in. And actually in the dark it's pretty easy to do. And if I line that up with my cutter, I basically have a suspension system that allows me to feed the paper right into the cutter. And of course I don't want to have stuff shifting about in the dark, so I use big clamps to clamp this down to the tabletop. And that is the basic setup. So the only thing that I need then is to determine the right length at which to cut, because we're working from roll, and basically we could use any length of paper that we want. The only limitation is the width, and that's just the width that the factory gives us. And well, for this particular sheet, I just cut it down to the standard paper size of 30 by 40.5 centimeters. So what I do to get that is just measure out the length that I need, and in this case I can use my paper as a template. Just put it here, get this little piece of wood, put it right there as a stop and tape it to the table. And if I then pull a little bit of paper through my cutter, I just put it underneath the guide here, I can just pull it through in the dark until it hits my stop, and then I just cut it. So it's very convenient, very easy. And usually when I cut paper, I just I position the roll and cut maybe 30-40 sheets of paper, maybe 10 or 20 if it's bigger sheets that I don't use up that much. So it's a very convenient way of cutting the paper. Just out of curiosity's sake, of course, this is something you'll generally never see in real life, but because you have to work with the paper in the dark. But this is what the paper looks like if it comes out of the box. So if you just cut it and you just take it into room light, this is what it looks like. And this is actually the Fuji paper that I was showing you. Actually, this is also Crystal Archive Supreme. It's actually HD, so it's the exact same paper that I was showing you here. It's just a test strip that I cut off and I just forgot to put it in a box or something. And as you can see, it's very nice light blue color that washes off in the first developer, in the color developer. And it's probably there for preventing things like halation, so the light spreading out on the paper. And maybe it's some sensitizing dyes as well. I'm not really sure why the color is there. I only know that all these color papers have this kind of colorful coating. And as you can see, well, if Fuji is a boy, then Kodak is a girl, because Kodak tends to be this pinkish color. So this is Kodak Royal digital paper, again optimized for digital enlarger or digital printing systems, but it works just fine under a regular enlarger. And well, it happens to be pink. I'm not sure why it's a pink dye and Fuji uses a blue dye, but that's just how it looks. So again, you will probably not see much of this because this is only something you can see on the fresh paper as it comes out of the box, and once it comes from the developer and the Blix, then this coloration is gone. But it's just to show what the paper looks like. So I promised to show you what the paper looks like up close, and especially the back side. Of course, this is the printed side, and you can see the shine, which is just due to the darkroom light. This is luster paper, so it has a bit of a shine. If I pick this Kodak paper, which is a glossy paper, you can see it's even a more violent shine. But if you look at the back side, then you see identifying information on the paper. And actually, I think you can see it in the image right now. And it says right here, so this is the brand Fujifilm. And here's the paper identification. So it's Fujicolor Crystal Archive Paper Supreme HD. And there's all kinds of variants of paper, a lot more than consumers generally know. And you can find information on this in the product sheets from resellers or importers, and well, you can figure out what kind of papers are available to you. So I bought this kind of paper, a couple of rolls. Usually comes in boxes of 2 rolls, so I bought 2 rolls and sold 1 roll off, and 1 roll I use myself. And just to give it a try, and it works absolutely brilliantly. So it's a very nice paper. It's the best paper I've used so far, definitely. Now, of course, to print we also need a negative, and maybe you can see it. I've got a contact sheet here that I made of these negatives, and they're in these paper sleeves, so you can't really see them very well. But of course, we need something to print, and these are all kind of boring images. I printed them or made them early this spring. And I'm going to select one image here at the bottom. So this is 35mm Fuji Superior 200. I choose this image because it has this overcast sky, and it has some variation in color here, and these are containers, as you will see later on, in front of some water. And this is going to help me color balance a little bit and demonstrate how that works. So I have to find this negative in my negative sheet. So I've got them here sleeved, and maybe you can tell here at the bottom is the image that I want to print. So I can see the negative here, and you may notice, although it's very difficult to see, that these negatives are pretty dense, and the reason for that is that this is pretty old film. So this is Fuji Superior 200, but it was expired I think in 2004, so it's probably about 15 or 16 years expired by now. I've used a lot of this film. I bought a lot of it. I bought like 50 or 100 rolls or so, and it turns out to work just fine, but it gives a lot of base fog, so I have to print through that. It prints about a stop slower than a fresh Kodak Portra or something like that. But you know, colors can still come out fine. So usually it's sort of a mixed bag with outdated film, and I would recommend if you just start printing color, then definitely use fresh film. Make sure it's properly developed. Just to get rid of those variables. But I know from experience that this film works just fine, and I can easily print it. So here's the negative that I want. I can take it out of the sleeve and maybe get a slightly better picture from it. And there you can see, there it is. It's pretty dense, like I said, this film, but you can at least see the negative that I want to print. And as you can see, there's some color in there, but it's also very difficult to accurately judge the color of color negatives by just looking at the film. It takes a lot of experience to get sort of a rough feeling from it, and I can never tell quite sure by just looking at the film how well it is developed and how it's going to print. So the proof is really in the printing with color. So one more thing we need for making prints, of course, is an enlarger, and this is the one that I'll be using today. This is an old Durst 138 that I actually converted to LED, so if I screw this over maybe you can see it. There's kind of a weird little contraption here, which is an LED light source, RGB LEDs. And well, I use this one because it covers all the formats that I use in photography. So from 35 millimeters up to 4 by 5 inches, which is as big as I go for enlarging. So this is kind of an odd contraption, so very old enlarger with a very modern light source that I made. Which is not to say that you need something like this, absolutely not. So just a plain old regular enlarger will do just as well. So let me take you through the room a little bit. So this is the enlarger that I just showed you, the one that I'll be using for my color prints. As you can see, it is just the head and baseboard with the printing frame. And this is the power supply unit and a control box. I will maybe do a separate information video on that one day, but I do have a link where I document this build, this enlarger, that I can put in the comments below. So this is the enlarger that I presently use, but I used to use this very simple Durst 670 605 enlarger. So this is a general color enlarger as you would have it maybe in your darkroom as well. And as you can see, it has this filter box with all the settings that we need. So we have yellow, magenta, and cyan. And you never touch the cyan dial for color printing on RA4 paper. Okay, so it's only controlled with yellow and magenta. And usually if you are looking for some base settings, just a negative that you haven't printed before, then you will dial in something like maybe 40 units of each of them. And that will get you somewhere in the ballpark, and then from there on you have to adjust it. So this is the way I did it up to a couple of months ago, before I made the LED enlarger, which works basically the same way. Actually, technically it's a lot different, but functionally it works in more or less the same way. And I can do the same kind of settings. So maybe I can show you a little bit. Let's start the beast up. Flip the switch on the power supply, and you can see the control unit is just started up, and I have some glare from the darkroom lighting, which is I can work around, I think. Actually, it's in black and white mode now, so I have to put it into color mode. There you go. And basically in color mode it also has yellow filtration settings, magenta. I didn't have an M, so I had to make this little icon, and cyan, which is always at 0. And this is where the time is in tenths of seconds. It's very nice for color printing to have a very precise timer, because the exposure times are usually pretty short. This is because color paper is very sensitive. So this is kind of the kind of time that I generally get. Like this is 4.4 seconds. And you may see that the numbers are much higher than the 40 and 40 that I just set on the other enlarger, which is just because I implemented this control unit with a lot more resolution than an old-fashioned color enlarger. So if you have 40/40 on the old enlarger, that would be about 100 and 100 on this one. And actually I'm a little bit higher here for the last print that I made. So here's my big film holder, and I'll get the template for a 35mm, which I can easily exchange. There we go. So this is the one we need, and of course my negative strip is still here. I always like to mount the film on my light box. It's a very simple tracing LED panel that I got off of eBay, I think. And so I usually put it in upside down, so the bottom of my image actually to that direction, which means that the image is going to be projected on my baseboard actually in the right way up, and for some reason it helps me focus. It doesn't matter functionally at all, but I just like to work that way. And having the backlight here, I can really see that I've positioned the film correctly, and I can just snap the holder in place and it's mounted and it's ready to go for the enlarger. So there's my mounted film, and let's put it into the enlarger, and it slides in really conveniently, and I've made it very easy to position it. So there it is, and now we're ready to position the image onto the baseboard. And of course the lights are on right now, so I'll have to turn those off in order to work on the image. I'll try to show that as well, but it's pretty straightforward to just, you know, position and focus the image. So what I did to make this visible is actually I turned on the red safe light in my darkroom, and please note that it's just for illustration, because obviously we cannot use this red light while printing color, but at least I can sort of show you what I'm doing and positioning the image on the baseboard. You can maybe just make out the image. And I generally just do the focusing by eye, so I don't have a grain enlarge or grain focuser or anything like that. I just put the image on the baseboard and then lean in close and shift the focus until I get the sharpest spot. I just wiggle a little bit and there it is. And if I want to get really sharp focus, what I do is I take a little bit of RA4 paper, so the paper that I'll be using for printing, I put it on the baseboard with the upside down, and then I focus on that. And that helps me to compensate for the thickness of the paper, because the working aperture that I will use on my lens is going to be 2 stops down from wide open. So I'm using an f4 lens, an 80mm f4 lens, and I'm going to use it at f8, which is kind of where the optimum sharpness is. So that's why I want to have pretty good focus for this. So as I explained, this is going to be room temperature development, and in terms of chemistry, that means I'm just going to use trays, and I've got these plastic storage boxes that I got for very cheap at a local store here, and it's just a plain old plastic storage boxes, nothing special about them, but I like them because they have a flat bottom, so they're completely flat, and that means I don't need to use a lot of chemistry for my developer and for my Blix. Well, there we are. And these are, as you can see, this is not a very official chemistry bottle. This is just a water bottle that I like using for my developer. And as you may notice, it's pretty dark brown. It's sort of the color of Coca-Cola, maybe a little bit less, or coffee or something like that. I've been using this developer for, I think, about 2 years now. And obviously it's not unchanged in these 2 years. This is a replenished developer, which is a very economic and effective and consistent way of working, I have found. And so I've been using this for a long time, and the only thing I need to do is when I start printing in a session, I need to sort of condition the developer. I replenish it. When I start, I always bring the pH up to the point where it needs to be, so it's on spec. And then I can easily print for a couple of hours using that. And maybe I check if it's a very long printing session somewhere in the middle, if the pH is still okay, and maybe I replenish if I make a lot of prints. So, and things like replenishment, it's always outlined in the instruction sheet or the data sheet of the developer that you use. And for making prints this size, I need, this is a liter of developer. For prints this size, I need maybe half a liter, 600 cc's, maybe 700. I just make sure there's a couple of centimeters depth, so the tray, the bottom is covered all the way, and I don't need much more than that. So this is about it. I think this is about 2/3 of the bottle that I just poured in. So that's my developer, and mind you, I still need to at least check the pH, because last time I used it, I replenished it before filling up the bottle. And so I do need to check the pH, because my experience is that with older developer that has been replenished a lot, the pH tends to drift downward. So for the stop bath, I just use cleaning vinegar, and again, this is not the official container. I just buy this in 5-liter boxes or jugs, and I just pour it into whatever convenient container I have. So generic cleaning vinegar, no perfumes or anything else, and that is usually about, I wrote it down, it's 7% I think. It's not very critical. So this is 7, 8, maybe 9% acetic acid, and that is what you can use perfectly fine for a stop bath. And what I usually do is just pour in, you know, a nice dash just by the seat of the pants, and then I need to dilute it down to 1 or 2%. Again, it's not critical, so I just put in some water. So it's about 1 plus 4 or so, and I use this for one session only, and if it gets too brown, because you always have some carryover from the developer into the stop bath, I just dunk it and make some new stuff. I mean, it's cheap as chips anyway. So on to the Blix. Blix is bleach and fix in the same solution, and I use a Fuji Blix, which comes as a 1-part concentrate, which I pour down from the original container into smaller bottles that I can tightly cap to keep out air. So this is the concentrate, and it needs to be diluted 1 plus 1 with water. It's not very critical, I found. And this is my working bottle that I also replenish and reuse all the time. And again, I need like maybe 600 milliliters, so let me get this into view a little bit. And as you can see, it's a sort of rusty brown color, because the main element of the Blix, it's actually two. One is an iron compound that actually does the bleaching, and the other is a fixer, which is basically just ammonium thiosulfate. And so the bleach part is actually what makes it brown. And before starting to print, I generally just make sure to replenish it to a nice working strength. So I will get a little bit of my stock solution, my concentrate, and I think I'll do just something like 50 milliliters. There you go, 50 milliliters of concentrate and about 50 milliliters of water. There you go. So there's my replenished Blix, and that'll work just fine. Recap the bowl, clean up my mess. There we go. So we've got the stop bath, we've got the Blix, we've got the developer, but it still needs to be brought up to the right pH. And my wash tray, I can put a little bit of water in there. So if I make my first test print, I can just dunk it right into there. So that's all I need. Now for conditioning the developer, but I'll bring you up a little closer so you can see what I'm doing. So let's condition our developer so it's on the proper pH. And like I said, usually when I start printing I also replenish it, but in this case I did it before I put it back into the bottle after the last printing session, so I only have to check the pH. For which I will use a pH meter. This is a fairly cheap one that I got from China. You can easily find them on AliExpress. There's also the other ones that you may be familiar with, the yellow ones, the little pen types. Problem is I've got 2 of these. I've had 3. One went bust on me when I dropped it into the solution stupidly, but I've got 2 of these, and out of the box they give completely different readings. So one may give 10.1 and the other may give 10.2 under the same circumstances with the same solution. So I don't consider these very reliable. They're kind of cheap and kind of fast, but I prefer not to use these. So this is the one that I used, and it has served me well. It's also temperature compensated. So I'm just going to put it in here, and maybe you cannot really read it. Just measure the pH. And actually, to my surprise, it reads 10.3. 10.30, and this needs to be 10.28, but it's not very critical, so actually reads 10.29 right now. This is right on the money, so I don't have to do anything about it. If it drops lower, so to 10.1 or 10.05 or something like that, what I do is just add a little bit of potassium hydroxide, just dry flakes, and dissolve that into the developer, and that brings up the pH. And I just keep measuring it until I reach the pH that I need to have. And then it turns out to be pretty stable over the course of a session. So with the Replenish developer that you use for a long time, so in this case it's about 2 years or so, with constant replenishment, I find that the pH is not very stable in due course, so you need to actually adjust the pH when you start printing. Over the first year or so of using the same developer batch, turns out it's pretty stable. So at some point stuff starts to drift, and I found that just compensating it is pretty effective. It gives consistent, repeatable prints. So that's what I do instead of dunking it all and making new developer. Now you may ask, so this is Replenish developer. What if I start over? What if I start new? And that's kind of a different story, because then if you have fresh developer, it needs to be started or seasoned. And that is basically a process in which the developer is brought to a repeatable state. And if you develop prints in your developer, all kinds of stuff from the print, from the paper, actually gets soaked into the developer. Most importantly, there are some compounds, so iodide and chloride, so halides basically, and these restrain the developer a little bit. And if you have fresh developer made from fresh concentrate, it doesn't have sufficient amount of these halides in it to make it work onto spec. And that means that if you make a first developer bath, you need to condition it, or you need to start it. And you can either do that by adding a starter, a fresh tank starter, which is sold separately, or as I like to do is just make a volume of fresh developer and then run maybe a square meter of paper through it. Just paper that you expose to room light, just put it in the developer, develop it, and after about, for a volume of about 1 liter, I think if you put in maybe 7 or 8 by 10 inch prints through it, then it's in a consistent working state. So that's when you start new, you have to start a developer as well. But since I use a seasoned developer, I can just adjust the pH and replenish as I go along, and it gives me consistent results. So like I said, this is room temperature development, so I have not done anything to bring up the developer temperature to the formal specification, which I think is something like 35 degrees centigrade, I'm not really sure even. This I just checked on the pH meter, it's about 20.5 degrees centigrade. Actually I've printed in developer that ranges from 16 degrees until about 25 degrees, and it always gives the same, more or less the same results. So it's pretty consistent, pretty repeatable. But the one thing that you need to change or need to account for is that the development needs to be long enough. And if the develop is colder than is specified, it just takes longer to develop it. And conveniently, developing color paper is basically a develop to completion process, which means that as long as the development is long enough, it gives pretty consistent results. And it's not very critical how long you develop, as long as it's long enough. And I've experimentally figured out that for this Fuji developer that I use, this is Fuji MP90, about 90 seconds at room temperature is right on the money. So I've got my little timer here, which is again a DIY job, and I can just put 1 minute and 30 seconds on that, and that will give me sufficient development. So now it's time to start making our first test print, or a test strip, to get our color filtration right. And of course, because we're going to print, we'll have to go to the dark, and I can show you actually in the dark how to do my settings, my trial settings for the first test print. So like I said, I've got my yellow, as you can see I can change it here on my yellow, my magenta filter settings, the cyan settings which I won't actually use, and then I have the time in tenths of seconds that I can also adjust here. And for starters, I'm just gonna put something in that probably won't be on the money, so I can at least show you how to filter properly. So I'm going to put something fairly random in here. Let's start at 100 and 100, which I know is not going to print well, but it's just for demonstration purposes. And for the time, well, maybe let's put something like 8 seconds or so. I should be able to get to 8. There we go. Here we are. So let's say 8 seconds, 100 yellow, 100 magenta. This would be about 40, 40 or maybe 30, 30 on a regular enlarger. So I'm going to do my trial print at these settings and then figure out where I need to go. So I've just made my first test strip. It went into the developer for 90 seconds, then very briefly into the stop bath, and it's now soaking in the Blix, and it's been there for maybe a minute while I was setting up the camera. And there I can take it out. Actually, you can see it here. We've got a bit of a picture. Bring it a little closer. And of course there's all yellow Blix dropping off it, so we need to clean it up a little bit. Just put it on the tap now. And the nice thing about RA4 paper is that it's very thin emulsion, and the base itself doesn't really soak up any moisture, so that means it rinses off pretty quickly as well. You don't need to wash it very long. If you make a print, if you wash it with a few changes of water in a minute or so, it's going to be totally clean. And for a test strip, this is already long enough. So for drying a test strip or a print, I just put a towel on my work surface and I get this little squeegee. This is one that's made for car windows actually. I had it lying around, but it works perfectly for this purpose. I generally just squeegee the back side first and then the front side, then most of our water is gone, and then it needs to be dried because it's still wet, obviously. And I just do that with a hairdryer. So I just take a basic hairdryer and then blast it on high heat, and within like 20-30 seconds it'll be dry. So here I've taken our test strip and I just cut it into half lengthwise, and I dried this half, and this half is still wet. And that allows you to see that there is actually a difference, and maybe, I hope you can see it on camera, but you can see it pretty well in the water area here, where it's a little washed out and also very magenta here, a little bluish tint to it, and here it's a lot warmer in color, and the blacks are proper black, and here they're not entirely properly black. So that shows you the difference, especially in the lower tones, between a wet and a dry color print. This is for color printing. We really need to dry it out before we can judge things like exposure and color. Let's have a closer look at our little dry test strip right here. And as you can tell, I positioned the test strip on my baseboard in such a way that I capture a very dark area of the image, as well as a very light, or even the lightest area of the image, and everything in between. So it's a convenient strategic positioning of the strip, so that even a narrow strip, this is only about an inch or so, a little more than an inch, it tells me more or less the entire story of the print. And you can tell right away that there's two problems. One is the exposure. It's way too dark overall. This is an overcast sky, and that should be pretty damn light because it's the lightest part of the image, and these shadows are pretty deep. So I need to back up on the exposure. And secondly, there's a huge problem with the color balance. But because if we change the exposure time significantly, we will also see a slight shift in color balance. So if you're starting out, it's a good idea to first fix the exposure so that it's pretty much dead on, and then start ironing out the problems with the color balance. So that's what we're going to do. And I know this was an 8-second test strip, and I will need to back up the exposure to maybe 4.5 seconds. I know from experience that this is roughly one stop too dark, maybe a little less. So I think I'm going to try for 4.5 seconds and then see how that comes out. And then we will probably still have a huge problem with the color, but we're going to fix that afterwards. So I've just made our second test strip, and the only thing I changed was I changed the exposure from 8 seconds to 4.5 seconds at the same taking aperture. And you can also tell that I wrote the exposure settings on both our test strips. This is the first one we made, and this is the second one I just made. And I always try to keep track of my exposure settings, so the yellow filtration and magenta filtration, the exposure time, and the aperture I use on the lens. Because if I make 6, 7, or 8 test strips, if it's a very challenging negative, it's very easy to lose track of, you know, what kind of settings that I use for each strip. And this way I always have a reference point that I can go back to if I sort of err too far for some reason or another. So it's just good practice to write down what you're doing. So this is our new strip. Same filtration settings, it's still the same yellow and magenta settings, but it's just a shorter exposure. And you can actually tell that if you look at the black line here between these containers and also the frame border, it's still pitch black, so that's very nice. And our sky is pretty light. It's not full white. You can see pure white here. You can also put this one next to it. There you can see as a reference. So it's a pretty light sky, and it's pretty much as you would experience an overcast, pretty light overcast sky. So in terms of exposure, this is more or less what we need. But obviously the color problem has not disappeared. This is still funky colors. And the most important thing that I see at this point is that it's way too magenta, right? It has this pinkish hue, especially in the sky, but also the water. The container colors are also not very fresh. It's all sort of a muddy brain stuff. And so the brown coloration, it looks like it has mostly to do with a magenta filter issue. So we've got 100 points of yellow, 100 of magenta, and I want to take some of the magenta coloration out. And our filtration in RA4 printing is that if you add more magenta, actually the print will become more green, so it's a negative process. So that means if I want to take out magenta, actually I will have to put more magenta into my exposure. And then it will shift to the complementary color, which is green. I will show you a little neat trick on that, by the way, if you find it difficult to memorize that, because it's you can make it easy on yourself. So this is something that I have on my darkroom wall as a reference, and of course at some point pretty quickly you know this by heart, but you see the color wheel, and this is just the whole color gamut that is visible to us. And of course we had a problem with our print, our test print, being too magenta, and I can see that the opposite color of magenta is green. So this is the complementary color. So basically my print is somewhere over here, it's too magenta, I want to shift it that direction. So this helps me if I see a print, for example, and I say, ooh, it's a little too blue, it's a bit too blue. So I take it into the opposite direction, so I need to add yellow basically. And another neat thing of this color chart that I printed out is that it has this grayscale, and it's an inkjet print, so it's not perfectly neutral gray, but it's sort of close, and it helps me to give a reference. So here I have my test print I just made, our test strip, and I can hold the sky part against my grayscale, and I can see that, yeah, it's way too magenta. It's definitely not a neutral gray, at least not by this reference. So that gives me a very quick visual confirmation that indeed I'm too far on the magenta part of this scale, so I need to shift a little bit more towards green. So I need to adjust my filtration settings on my enlarger head. And so I have this magenta, I have 100 dialed in. I need my print to become more green, and that means I have to add magenta to my filter pack. So I'm going to make a pretty big change here. I'm going to go to, let's say, 120. And if you use a normal color head, you would change maybe to 10 cc or so, 10 units. So here's our third test strip that I just made, and I changed the magenta to 120 in order to get rid of that, sort of pinkish cast that I had here. And maybe you can tell that it's mostly gone now. If I look very critically, it's still a little bit there. And because the magenta is gone, so the sky has become much more neutral, it's also much more difficult to distinguish it from pure white. But if you look in the physical print, and I'm not sure if it's going to show on camera, but in the physical print there's actually the distinct difference. So I know that the exposure is still pretty much spot on. Maybe I'd like to add a few tenths of a second to the exposure to compensate for the loss in density that I have here right now. But overall the magenta problem is more or less fixed. But I think I have a new problem now, or at least a problem that I didn't see before, which is that it's, to my taste, it's overall too warm, it's too yellow. And you can tell in the water and also in the containers. And I know that the water is kind of a murky brown, so that's not necessarily a problem. But this greenish tint in the container, in my memory, it was a little cooler. And I think the sky is a little warm as well. So I think I'm going to do a few changes. And I know what they say about only change one variable at a time. And this is generally true. So I would recommend if you're starting out with color printing, just choose change only one color filtration setting at a time, only change exposure at a time, and don't change anything else. So only change one variable at a time. But personally, because it's just quicker that way, I like to modify different variables at the same time. And based on the experience I have, I usually get away with it as well. So there's a few things I'm going to fix. Firstly, it has become a little bit too light overall, this entire print. So this 4.5 seconds, I'm going to change it to maybe 4.8 seconds or so, just to get a little more density in the sky. So I'm going to make it 4.8 seconds. Secondly, I have a little bit of magenta still in the sky, so I'm going to change this 120 to, let's say, 123 or so. It's only a very small change. So that's 4.8 seconds, 123 on magenta, and I'm going to try to fix that yellow stuff. And the yellow problem is not as big as the magenta problem I had before, so I'm going to probably change this to, well, let's say 112. So I'm going to add 12 points of yellow. So recap, 12 points of yellow. I'm going to add maybe 3 points of magenta, and I'm going to add maybe 0.3 of a second. And I'm going to make a test print, and hopefully I'm pretty close by that time. So there's our fourth test print, and what went well is that the yellow filtration really helped a lot. It's a lot less warm. It's still not to my liking. I still find this too warm, but you can actually see that this is the same container. That this is a very greenish, a yellowish green, and this is much more the green that I remember it to be. But I think I can do it even a little bit more than that. You know, by increasing the exposure, I can tell a bit more about the density and the color of this sky, and I'm still not happy with the magenta cast here. It's still too much to my liking. I can demonstrate it by holding it against our grayscale reference. So let me take you with our little print to the grayscale reference that I have here on my wall. And the smartphone doesn't do a very good job at picking up the colors, I can tell, but you can maybe see that it's still a little bit, I'll try to nail the exposure a bit more, it's still a little bit pink. And actually, if I look at the print, it's still a little warm to my taste as well. I'm pretty happy with the exposure, so I'm not going to change the exposure time, but I'm going to try and fix the magenta issue a little bit. And I've got on my enlarger, so I set magenta to 123. I think it's still not enough, so I'm actually gonna increase that to well, let's put another 5 points. So let's go to 128. And as to the yellow problem, it's still a little bit warm to my eye. So I'm gonna maybe add 4 units there as well. Let's go to 116. I think then we're pretty close for the print that I want to make. There we are. This is probably the last test strip I will make of this negative, because I feel we're pretty close in terms of color and exposure. So here's our final print, and I reckon by now it's sufficiently blitzed, so I'm going to take it to the wash. And like I explained before, color paper doesn't need an extensive wash, so you don't need the 1-hour wash that you need with the fiber-based black and white paper or anything like that. It's a very quick process, and just goes through a few changes of water, that's all. So just rinse a little bit. If you can, maybe you can see it, the wash water is a little bit yellow now. This is from the Blix that hangs onto the paper. I'm going to dump that. Get in some new water, agitate a little bit, and actually by now this water looks more or less clear. There's nearly no Blix in it anymore. So I'll give it another wash for good measure. It doesn't hurt to wash these prints a little longer. I mean, they don't deteriorate or anything. You can easily leave them in the wash water for an hour or so to soak while you do something else. It doesn't hurt a bit, but it's not necessary either. So I think, you know, for a print that I consider important that I want to put on the wall or something like that, usually I'll just wash it with 4 changes of water in about a minute, minute and a half, something like that, and it's adequate. I mean, those prints, they don't yellow, or they seem to be just remain in good order. So you can now see our print. Looks like it's coming out okay. Of course, you can't really judge the color or the exposure accurately because it's still wet, but I think this is gonna come out just fine as it is. So let's take it out of the wash and dry it down and see how it ends up. So there we go. Pick it up. That's the only drawback of these flat bottom trays, is that it's sometimes difficult to pick up the paper from the tray because it tends to stick to the bottom. But well, I can live with that. There it goes, face down on the towel. I just squeegee it. So there it is, all dried and finished. Our final print with the test strips beside them that it was basically the route that we took to get to this end result. And then of course, if I figured it out for one image, I could just take a negative from the same roll and print it just with the same settings, and it's probably going to come out just right. So that's all there is to it, making a color print. We just made this one using a couple of test strips that we used to figure out what kind of color settings we needed, and the end result looks perfectly presentable. So I hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them at the comments. I try to answer as much as I can. No guarantees though. And definitely I hope you're going to give it a try if you like color printing, or if you like this video, because we cannot have enough color darkroom printers in the world, because that keeps it alive for all of us. So thanks for watching.